Good morning and welcome to the Start Your Own Net Zero Journey webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. From lockdown Melbourne, I want to give a big thanks for an excuse to wear a shirt and jacket. Haven't done this for about 5 months, so thank you very much. Been trying to think about positives of the lockdown in Melbourne and the fact that I can speak to close to 100 people and you have no idea I'm wearing slippers is one of those for sure. I'm Scott Ferrara, I'm the Program Director of the Net Zero Initiative at Monash Uni and your host for this webinar today. This webinar is part of a series being run by the Monash Energy Institute. It aims to share some of the insights from across 170 odd energy related researchers and associated colleagues at Monash, and really to get some of what we're learning as we journey towards net zero out into the broader world. You can have a look at the Monash Energy Institute webinar page, which has got some upcoming webinars to be listed. One of those includes one on the Monash microgrid, which will be posted shortly as well. Some news from the Monash Energy Institute as well. We've had the announcement of a new director, Associate Professor Ariel Lieberman, and a new Deputy Director as well, Dr Rob Brimblecombe. So I just wanted to send all my congratulations to those two, but also pass on some acknowledgement and thanks to Professor Jack Jeseniak, the outgoing director, who's moved into a role as an Associate Dean of Research in the Engineering School as well. We're broadcasting here as a team from Melbourne, so I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations whose land we're virtually gathered on here today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the other traditional owners from wherever else you are based in Australia as you're zooming in. This webinar runs for an hour and will be recorded. It will be available on the Monash Energy Institute website in case you want to recap the highlights as our talkers go through their presentations. Format-wise, we'll hear short 8-minute presentations from our 3 panellists, and then there'll be 20-30 minutes for a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. In the Q&A, you can either post questions through the chat forum, or you can raise your hands and ask a question verbally, which is a very old-fashioned way of doing it. So with those intros done, on to today's webinar. We're going to get a diverse view of the challenges and opportunities to achieve net zero. We all know the significant challenge ahead of us if we want to deliver on the commitments under the Paris Agreement. And we all know that a number of governments and businesses have really started to take the first steps, but there's questions on how fast do we really need to go to deliver on those targets. What technologies and practices do we have at our disposal to get there? How do we go from incremental change to the large-scale transformation and transition that's required? Or how do I simply get started on this journey? So our panel of 3 experts from across Monash will hopefully shed some light on some of these questions and more for you. We're going to kick off with Amandine Denis-Ryan from ClimateWorks, who's going to give us the national perspective of what Australia needs to do to meet its Paris commitments based on their recent Decarbonisation Futures report. We'll then hear from Professor Rob Brimblecombe from the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. He's going to give us a perspective of the role that experimentation at the urban or precinct scale can play in net zero transitions. And then to wrap up, we'll hear from Dr Rob Brimblecombe from Monash's Building and Property Division, who'll give us sort of an applied perspective of achieving net zero at Monash as well. And then we'll roll into the Q&A session and a discussion amongst the panel at the end as well. So now to hand over to our first speaker, Amandine, who's the Head of National Programs at ClimateWorks. I've had the pleasure of working with Amandine for 5 years or more, and really she's a global leader in developing decarbonisation pathways, and the work she and ClimateWorks have done has influenced governments and policy settings, as well as corporate action in this space. She also makes a 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗿𝘀 as well, if you want to ask her about that, but right now I'll hand over to Amandine.
Hi, forgot to unmute myself, of course. Thanks, Scott, for this glowing intro. I had not planned to talk about 𝗻𝗲𝗿𝘀, but maybe I'll find a way to include it in my presentation. So today I'll talk about our recent research decarbonisation futures, as well as some action that we're seeing from companies. And I will start by talking about net zero. What does net zero actually means? Well, there are technology solutions available today which can help remove the emissions from our homes and economies. We usually group them under 4 pillars. The first one is energy waste reduction, in particular through energy efficiency and a shift away from energy intensive products and services. The second one, 100% renewable electricity. Third one, electrification. So we shift everything that we can to electricity, and we shift away from fossil fuels to zero or near zero emissions alternatives. And finally, we reduce non-energy emissions as much as possible and offset residual emissions. So we recently released a report called Decarbonisation Futures, which reviewed technologies available to reduce emissions across all sectors and how much progress has been made since our last big report, which was in 2014. What we found is that there had been remarkable progress achieved in particular in renewables and batteries. Solar installations achieved in 5 years what was meant to take 20. The cost of new wind and solar, even with hours of storage, is now unequivocally lower than fossil fuel. Batteries have followed a similar route. They now cost 80% less than in 2010, and this has supported a boom in electric vehicles. Quite excitingly, we have also seen a lot of progress in what we call the hard-to-abate sectors. Sectors like large industry, heavy transport, beef production, where back in 2014, we could not yet imagine a zero emissions futures. And the extraordinary progress in batteries, for example, means that electrification is now a solution which can be applied to more transport modes. We're now seeing small electric planes enter the market, short-haul electric ferries are in operation, and it's now also likely that heavy trucks could also be electrified in the future. For sectors where it's very expensive or complicated to reduce emissions to zero, we are seeing alternative solutions emerge, which can help reduce our reliance on the most emissions-intensive products. So for example, cross-laminated timber can now replace steel and cement in the construction of mid-sized buildings, and plant-based alternatives are increasingly appealing to consumers as a replacement to beef. So these are just a few examples. Our report reviews all major emissions reduction technologies and solutions across sectors, and we have found that the progress achieved in the last 5 years has now closed the technical gap to zero emissions in all sectors. In electricity and buildings, zero emissions is doable with technologies which are already mature or demonstrated, in particular renewables, storage, and energy efficiency. In transport, the solutions are at different level of maturity depending on the modes. As mentioned before, for cars and short-haul transport, they can be electrified. For long-haul, a range of zero-emission fuels are likely to be needed. They include biofuels, especially second and third generation, which don't compete with food production, renewable hydrogen and ammonia, or synthetic fuels. In industry and agriculture, zero-emission solutions are still emerging. In those sectors, this decade, we can focus on deploying best practice technologies, for example, in energy and other resource efficiency, while ensuring that we are ready to deploy the new technologies when they will be available. Nature-based solutions, such as carbon forestry, can also help compensate any residual emissions from other sectors. So, in the last 5 years, one evolution which hasn't been as positive is the trend in global emissions, which have kept increasing over the period. What this graph shows is the remaining global carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming updated to the start of 2020. In short, to have a good chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, the remaining global carbon budget is 336 gigatons CO2. It corresponds to only 8 years worth of emissions at current rates. To have a good chance of keeping global warming below 2 degrees, the remaining global carbon budget is a bit more than 1,000 gigatons CO2. It corresponds to 26 years worth of emissions at current rates. What this means is we have lost very valuable time, and that the decrease towards zero emissions needs to start immediately and to be a lot steeper than if we had started action 10 or 20 years ago. The good news is that the technologies are now available to allow us to leapfrog to zero emissions, equipment and processes, and to keep those goals within reach. So our Decarbonisation Futures report also includes modelling results for 3 scenarios which achieve net zero emissions by or before 2050. Our scenario analysis shows that Australia can still achieve trajectories compatible with the Paris climate goals. However, it shows that those trajectories involve very strong emissions reductions this decade, about 50% reduction below 2005 levels in 2030 for the 2-degree scenarios, and about 75% reduction below 2005 levels for the 1.5-degree scenario. All of our scenarios see a much accelerated deployment of emissions reduction technologies than we would expect under business as usual. For example, while the government currently projects that about 1 in 5 cars will be electric by 2030, our scenarios see about 1 in 2 cars electric by 2030, and in our 2-degree scenarios, and about 3 in 4 being electric by 2030 in our 1.5-degree scenario. Similarly for renewables, while the government currently projects that we will have nearly 50% renewables by 2030, our scenarios see between 70 and 80% of renewables in our electricity generation by 2030. In parallel, our scenarios see much accelerated development of emerging solutions, such as renewable hydrogen, 2nd and 3rd generation biofuels, and lab foods or enteric fermentation treatments. These solutions are then deployed at scale after 2030. This kind of acceleration will not happen in time without strong action by government, business, and individuals. Governments in particular have a key role to play by developing supportive policies, removing roadblocks, making direct investments, and incentivizing the private sector to invest and act. Businesses also have a critical role to play in aligning their products and services, their operations, their R&D investments, and their procurement to a net zero trajectory. Setting a net zero target can be an important first step in this direction. One thing that's quite important to note is the focus on accelerated deployment for both mature and demonstrated technology. Deployment is what has enabled the recent progress we have seen in renewables and batteries, where economies of scale have driven very large cost savings, and improvements have been driven by engineering solutions and competitiveness between providers. The Monash Net Zero initiative is a really great example of how an organization can take the lead on deploying emerging technologies to accelerate their progress. So who's heading towards net zero? Well, in 2015, in Paris, all of the world's governments agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. Since then, targets of net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier have become the norm, followed by governments, businesses, and investors in Australia and around the world. Over 100 countries and all Australian states and territories have net zero targets in place. Investors worth more than $4 trillion, and some of Australia's and the world's largest companies have also committed to this goal. Quite importantly, at the beginning, this was mostly including companies in low-emitting sectors like property and technology, but recently it has extended to high-emitting sectors such as heavy industry and freight. For example, Rio Tinto and Qantas now have a net zero emissions target. Another important element is that companies are starting to include Scope 3 emissions in their targets, which means the emissions associated with their investments and the products they sell, rather than just the emissions associated with their operations. So for example, very recently, the super fund 𝗗𝗲𝗲 announced a net zero target for its investment portfolio. And BP announced a big investment plan to transform its business alongside its operational net zero target. It will multiply its investment in renewable energy sources tenfold by 2030 to 5 billion per year, and will reduce its oil production by over 40% over the same period. If you're interested in more information about net zero pledges, we have recently launched a website called Net Zero Momentum Tracker, which provides information on recent announcements and sectoral progress. So in short, after missing our chance to start reducing emissions in the last decade, which was the critical decade for climate change, we have now entered the transformational decade. In order to stay within the goal of 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming, emissions need to head towards zero at a steep pace. The good news is that we can do this by accelerating the deployment and development of available technologies to leapfrog to zero emission solutions. We just need more and more organizations to start the net zero journeys as soon as possible. And that will be it for me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amandine. a big challenge, lots of opportunity, but action needed all over the place. A nice segue into our second speaker, Professor Rob Brimblecombe, who's going to talk through the perspective from urban transitions. And so Rob is a Professor of Sustainability Transitions and the Research Director at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. He's been leading the development of a research program at Monash focused on transitioning precincts to net zero emissions. And as a self-declared reformed engineer come social scientist, he's got a unique perspective with a really strong focus on interdisciplinary approach to help address these challenges. He's true to his Dutch heritage and has a love for bikes as well, especially e-bikes. So feel free to ask him about that, but over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Scott. Let me share my screen. There you go. And for the record, I am not wearing slippers. I'm just wearing normal shoes. Thanks, Scott, for that introduction. I have to talk for the next 8 or 10 minutes about sort of an academic perspective, if you like, a way of looking at urban transitions and the role that the Monash Net Zero initiative can play in these broader processes of change. So maybe just first a slide that most of you will be familiar with, but why are urban net zero transitions important? And why look at the urban basically? So more than half of the global population lives in cities these days, and that's expected to increase to about 75% in 2050. Cities account for about 2/3 of global energy demand, and more than 70% of global carbon emissions can be originated to urban demand. Cities are also economic powerhouses, if you like. 80% of all GDP is produced in and through cities, and the World Resources Institute, for instance, has calculated that a transition to net zero cities in 2050 actually presents an opportunity of about 24 trillion investments just in terms of the infrastructural changes that are needed to realize that. As Amandine already alluded to, many different governmental organizations and businesses committed to net zero, including cities. So a recent estimate is that about 100+ cities have committed to net zero ambitions worldwide. And what we try to do in this program is then to ask the question, how do you actually go about with such a major challenge? Because you can't change cities overnight into net zero cities. And this is where we think the precinct comes in or the district comes in as an appropriate and an effective skill for accelerating net zero transitions. So the way we tend to look at this is through a socio-technical perspective. And just to illustrate what we mean by this, I like to use the example of mobility. So currently we have a socio-technical system in place that allows us to drive from A to B. Usually you think of the car as the main core element in that system, but what makes it possible for us to drive from A to B is a lot more. So there's obviously infrastructures in place, roads, etc., that we drive on. There's a global value chain in place that actually produces the cars. There's financing schemes in place. If you need to borrow money, the bank knows what you're borrowing it for, so you can actually get funding to finance your cars. But there's also things like culture and symbolic meanings to the car attached as a symbol of freedom and individuality, and so on and so forth. So this is a system that has grown and got internally aligned over more than 100 years. So you can imagine if we would like to change that towards a more sustainable socio-technical system that consists of things like shared electric vehicles, bike riding, walkable neighborhoods, bus rapid transit systems, and so on. It's not just a simple replacement of the car with an electric vehicle, but it needs to changes in all these other dimensions as well. Most notably, the demand side and the consumer side is critically important, and there might be resistance in this on the demand and the consumer side, but also on the political side. So we need actually multidimensional understandings and theories and approaches to look at what these transitions are and how they come about. What this approach says is we need to understand the tools and the mechanisms to go from a given socio-technical system that we find ourselves currently into one that is more sustainable. And several historical studies have been tracing how these transitions emerge. They usually take about 50 or 60 years or more. The good news for net zero transitions is that they started already in the 1970s, already 50 years down the line. So maybe we can do it in the next 10 years. The way then the rest of these slides go about is to say, well, there's value in then bringing that systemic view down to a way and asking, how can we actually navigate these transitions in more shorter term interventions? Now there's an emerging literature, but also a global urban practice of using the notion of experimentation as an alternative to more formal ways of planning urban change. This goes back to the mid-1990s when early writings started to come about experimentation to shift existing social-technical systems into more sustainable ones. And it is tremendously diversified along the way. We recently did a review in which we've identified and defined experiments as inclusive, practice-based, and challenge-led initiatives designed to promote system innovation through social learning under conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity. And I could probably speak to each of these terms in a lot more detail, but I don't have the time to do so. Just noting the notion of ambiguity is pretty important here, in the sense that urban transformations and transitions more generally, although the notion of net zero suggests them to have a quite clear endpoint in time, there might actually be very, very different ways of how people and organizations understand what that endpoint should look like. Both of them might be net zero, but the actual outcome in terms of the configurations might be very different. And that's what the notion of ambiguity refers to. In a recent book, we specifically looked empirically at what various cities are doing around urban experimentation, and specifically looks at which kind of interventions enable sustainable urban systems, consisting of different types of infrastructures, technologies, institutions, and behaviors, and models to come about, how they scale, and how they can accelerate with positive impact. And also questions around what are actually the enabling as well as constraining conditions of such interventions. Just to showcase a little bit what's in that book, 3 examples of urban experiments. And this is to demonstrate that there's a lot of variety in what urban experimentation might look like. So on the left side, there's an example which is very much a grassroots approach to urban experimentation, which involves citizens in Berlin setting up a place for experimenting with alternative food cultures and practices, coming together, growing their own food, lecturing each other on what sustainable and healthy food practices look like, and learning from each other. On the right side is maybe a more well-known example of 𝗗𝗲𝗻𝗀𝗄 city in Abu Dhabi, which is essentially a high-tech cluster which has been in place for many years now, where essentially a new city is built from nothing, with an expectation of net zero emissions and net zero waste, 50% less energy production and water use, very walkable and cyclable urban designs. This promise hasn't come through so radically as it emerged in the beginning, but it has generated a great deal of lessons and learning of how you can do more sustainable urban design. And then in the middle is an example from India, where in New Delhi, government tried to shift the very unhealthy and unequal practices in rickshaws towards e-rickshaws through an experiment with about 100,000 e-rickshaws in place. Again, this was quite a learning process with struggles and challenges. By now, there are about a million e-rickshaws on the streets of Delhi, but still there's a lack of a good charging infrastructure, for instance, and the issues around licensing these e-rickshaws. So it's a socio-technical learning process that continues to go on, and this is where experimentation can actually be helpful. Now, the way in which in Monash, and that is my almost last slide, we use that notion of urban exploitation is through the language of living labs or urban living labs. This is, you could say, the latest reincarnation of that idea that experimentation is useful. What I try to do in this slide is to say, well, what is actually a living lab or an urban living lab? It has a diverse set of understandings, often quite unarticulated. So for some, a living lab is an ecosystem of connected actors, projects, activities, and resources. For others, a living lab is a context, a real life test environment in a specific location. Again, for others, it's a form of collaboration in terms of a university-industry partnership. Living labs can also refer to new ways of engagement, for instance, to involve and empower communities and citizens. It can be a methodology for applied and interdisciplinary research, a form of demonstration to showcase capabilities, new products, services, or leadership. It's used in terms of generating and managing innovation. And finally, as a form of transformation, that's how I've been speaking about it in this talk so far, as a mode for governing far-reaching change. And some might say that makes this whole living lab concept a fuzzy and ill-defined concept. I would say it's actually quite a useful boundary object that allows various types of actors with very different kinds of interests to collaborate, despite perhaps a shared understanding of what they are collaborating around. As a final slide, just a peek preview of what we're hoping to do in the Monash precinct environment, where we are building a program of work to help transition not only the Monash campuses, but also the wider precinct towards a net zero future. And we hope to do so through a systematic approach that tries to listen to all the relevant stakeholders in this area, collectively envision net zero precinct futures and identify possible pathways to realize that, or a portfolio of pathways, establish living lab experiments to explore some of the uncertainties and drive learning processes around these uncertainties, and then have a process of monitoring in place that also allows us to translate and learn what we've done in Monash to other places as well. Thanks. Here are a couple of links for those who want to know a bit more about myself or some of the work that I've been talking about.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. From one Rob to the next, focused on an applied living lab and what we're looking at doing and currently doing at Monash Uni. So Dr Rob Brimblecombe is the Manager of Engineering and Sustainability in Monash's Buildings and Property Division. Rob's overseen the development of the Net Zero initiative, so he can give you some valuable insights into what's required to take a great idea and turn it into reality, and the practical challenges on delivering on that. When he's not teaching a class of 2 from home, he's also a budding seaweed farmer, but that feels like a whole nother webinar topic that we'll have to come back to. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mr. Ferrero. So I guess picking up on the outline that Amandine's put out, and I guess that framework that Rob's put forward of solving these challenges, you know, for us at Monash, it's very much about how do we get on and start learning this and put our practice, the learning into play. So I guess our journey started many years ago. And I think, like so many people, the critical bit with any successful journey is to do your homework up front. In my case, that means finding some aspiring students and get them to do my homework for me. So back in 2014, we got a group of students to map out what would be a credible transition for the university. Back then, it seemed like a big stretch, but they did the homework, they did the maths, and they said, well, some things are emerging, some things are hard, but it's possible. And I guess the journey can start now. There are things we can do now, and some of the more challenging things we can work on in later years. So those students came up with this diagram here, which basically shows a baseline of Monash's energy. This is its operational energy. Our current target focuses on the operation of our campuses, our 4 Australian campuses, but certainly looks more broadly into how we can influence the policy agenda, how we can influence mobility, and really how we can start looking upstream at the embodied energy of our campuses. But the general transition for us, as laid out by Amandine, and I'll refocus on this in a coming slide, is that we need to electrify, we need to improve the efficiency of our campuses, which in big part is in the heating and cooling. Lighting and appliances play a significant role. Maximising on-site renewables. As an energy-dense organisation with a lot of plant and equipment on our roof, on-site renewables is not a huge back player for us, as you can see this relatively small line here. And then sourcing the balance of our energy from off-site renewables. So making sure that we're putting as much renewable energy into the grid. And I guess picking up on one of the questions, in our case, we actually have more renewable energy up our sleeve at the moment to deal with some of those broader issues of transmission losses and accounting for all those type of things. So do your homework, get started. In our case, we did the homework, and then the homework sat on the shelf for a couple of years until the timing was ready. To do that, to be ready, you've also got to obviously identify the risks and the benefits to your organisation. It's different. The motivation for each organisation is different. The angle that will work for your organisation at that time will be different. For us, as I said, we started with the students. These are the 3 students that cooked it up. Cara, Joe and Tim, all successful advocates in the space in their professional lives now. But effectively for Monash University, these are our clients. These are the voice of our customer. So leveraging that voice, it sounds manipulative, but it was a little bit, getting the students to come up with the idea, getting the students to do the homework and getting the students to champion this really caught the attention of the university. And then critically, you've got to get your influencers and your leaders on board to get the message across, so you can do something bold like set a public target, which then sets the whole organisation behind you. So again, these are just some of the players. Amandine, Scott, we're also heavily involved in this journey. But Anna Skarbek, head of ClimateWorks, the story that I like to tell, whether it's true or not, is that Anna and I met at a GBCA session. We had a chat and said, I think I'm ready. Let's get going. These students are ready to go with their project. And I said, great. She went and whispered in Rebecca's ear. Rebecca went and whispered in Margaret Gardner's ear, and then Margaret Gardner came and said, you need to set a net zero program because we're going to get to net zero by 2030. And we said, okay, here's a project that we've got ready to go. Then we engaged Scott to go away and do the homework. Again, check the numbers, make sure the student project was sound, and then we got on and we set that target. So part of that was embedding it into the fabric of the university, embedding it into the goals, the aspirations and the public statement documents of the university. So that started with our environmental, social and governance statement in 2016. The commitment there was to transition to net zero as soon as possible. In 2017, after a lot of homework, a lot of advocacy, we got the University Council to sign off on the 2030 target and put the investment behind it as well. And then I think critically to the momentum, in 2018 was successful in securing a Monash Leadership on Climate Action, sorry, reading my own slides there, a Momentum for Change award from the UN, which obviously adds notoriety to the program, gives it a global scale, and this helps to pick the program up and allow the university to own it in a public space. So for the university, obviously the motivation is to be a community leader, a global leader in this space. This is the role of universities, to show what's possible. So working with industry, working with our researchers, working with the next generation of professionals is very much what we're trying to do. And that's on brand for the university. Different organisations have different drivers of where they need to be in the market and what works for them. But I think Monash is unashamedly saying we are committed to a sustainable future, but we're also committed to the sustainability of our business. And these two things are complementary. It is absolutely a virtuous cycle for us. So getting down into some of the technical, some of the journey and relating it back to Amandine's, and apologies Amandine, I've butchered up the 4 pillars of net zero here, but the story still runs. Effectively what we've done is we've tried to leverage all of those elements of achieving net zero against the drivers of our business. So things like on-site renewables, great thing to do, very public, an easy, quick win you can start with, good payback, but they save you money. Behind the meter generation of power is, for us, by far the cheapest power we can get. Rolling out LEDs, great energy efficiency, but just as critically, not having to change light bulbs is critical to the business continuity of our business. It means that our lectures can go on uninterrupted. It means that our technical people aren't building in scaffolds to change the light bulbs in lectures. Sometimes the scaffolding to change lighting in lecture theatres is more expensive than the light bulbs themselves. In fact, it always is. We were opportunistic in the market and we got an early leader advantage with the 𝗗𝗲𝗻𝗀 wind farm. Effectively, in this case, there was an opportunity there. We leveraged our purchasing power to secure a supply of renewable energy more than we need at the moment, accounting for the electrification journey over the next decade or so. So this is not only a source of renewable energy for the university, but it's also a financial position for us to secure and insulate us against the ups and downs of the energy market. So both a good thing to do for the environment, but also a really important thing to do to help us manage our financial position in these incredibly uncertain times. Moving on from there, I guess the big trick then is to build your reputation. This was something that we needed to do anyway. We needed to improve the quality of offering that we provide to our buildings and to our building occupants. The university, effectively what it does is provide space for people to think, for people to learn. The best place to do that is space that you're inspired by, the place that has healthy environments, the place that has inspiration, views, daylights, fresh air, all of these things that we'd love to have in our homes and in our buildings. So we started down this journey towards net zero ready buildings. It was a long journey. The industry came with us. Some of the people on this call I know are out there have helped us on this journey, but effectively we've reached a position now where we have super efficient buildings. They're all electric, and with the wind farm and their rooftop solar are now operating as a net zero future. They are really great buildings to be in. And like I said, they're filled with fresh air and daylight, which is what we want our students to experience. The picture here is 𝗗𝘗𝗲𝗿𝗀. It's one of the experiments we've done into going into low carbon construction. The full structure above the ground level is concrete because it's on a floodplain, but upwards from that, it's all CLT, so timber built, and it goes right up to that 6th level. Not only does it obviously reduce the embodied carbon for the building, but it also is a great engagement for the building. There's lots of exposed timber. It still has the smell of the resin in the building. It's that connection to nature that our students enjoy. All right, there's my timer, Scott, moving on quickly. And then I guess the final element of our program is innovation through partnership. Some of these big challenges, electrification, grid interaction, how do we change the energy market so it accommodates a renewable future, so it accommodates a dynamic precinct that can interact with the market. These are challenges that Monash is certainly up for taking on, but we're not going to be able to solve them by ourselves. So we're reaching out to industry, we're working with our researchers, working with our students, working with our industry partners to try and solve these problems and solve them in a way that can be replicable. Our first net zero director, 𝗗𝗲𝗲𝗿𝘀, was very much of the principle that whatever we do at Monash must be transferable. We can't do an ivory tower solution because we're a big university. We need to do a solution that we can scale to the home level, that you can scale to the precinct level, that you can scale to the city level. So it's very much about building up those quick wins, get your momentum, grab the early benefits, establish a market leadership position. So you reinforce it with the leaders. Your leaders can then stand up and talk about it off the cuff. And then finally, that innovation is where the opportunity for universities are, but partnering with others, it's a big challenge and you don't have to do it all on your own. So that's where we're at on our journey. I guess the takeaways are that we're reducing our energy intensity, and as of this year, we're 55% renewable powered. And over the coming years, we're well set to make that transition and take advantage of what the future of a renewable energy market looks like for both the university and industry. So I'll call it there, only a minute over time.
Well played, very, very self-disciplined of you, Rob, to have a timer, thank you. So thanks very much to the three panellists for their presentations. Now we've got time for Q&A. We've had some questions float in and I'll just pull a couple of those out. Also, if you'd like to ask a real question, hopefully you've got a raise hand function on the Zoom. If you put that up, Nancy will be able to unmute you, and if you can introduce yourself and where you're from, and then ask a brief question to one or all of our speakers, that would be great. Rob B, just while we're on you, there was a couple of questions that came in, one around COVID and the impact COVID's had on the university, but I guess more, have we considered remote learning as an opportunity to achieve net zero in terms of taking people off campus and reducing our own energy use as well?
Yeah, and there's a benefit certainly in our short-term reporting that COVID's delivered. It's not one that we would have chosen, but certainly our air mile emissions are well down as a university for 2020 to date. But I guess the reality is that universities are there to educate students and to get them ready for the workforce. So there's certainly some online learning that you can do, and the university's shown that it can do most of its learning online this year. But we still view our campuses and the interactions, the collaboration that take place on campus as a critical part of it. So delivering information, providing new insights is absolutely something we can do online. But certainly going forward, we're very keen to get people back on campus to interact. As we're doing right now, we work as a team. Nothing in net zero has been achieved as an individual. So that ability to interact, that ability to collaborate with your peers and that ability to effectively, be a functioning part of society is very much a part of the degree as much as it is that the knowledge you pick up. Most of the knowledge will evolve over your working career. So it's, those interactions that are critical. So certainly we see a role for that telecommuting and that online presence, but it's only part of what the university offers in its student body.
Perfect, thank you. A quick one for the other Rob before I go to some attendees who've got their hand raised. Stephen Kenway asked around any policy or regulatory experiments that you envisage doing at the precinct scale, and whether there's been anything done yet on this front that you could take a look at.
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. Thanks for asking that. And I guess there's sort of two ways of answering it. One is an answer around what sort of policy experiments can we envision here that actually is more about what sort of new policies can we think of and experiment with. So one example would be questions on regulating the electricity market in a situation where there's a lot more decentralized electricity generation through microgrids and so on. And that's actually one of the experiments that's going on right now at the campus, the microgrid experiment at the campus in Clayton. And another example would be something that I'm keen to explore around the idea of pop-up cycling lanes. So Scott mentioned I like cycling. I'm a Dutch person, so that's why I keep talking about it. But I also believe it has a place in future net zero cities, very much so, because it's a net zero healthy option of getting around. And there's quite a lot of councils in the light of the COVID situation have started experimenting with pop-up cycling lanes, so temporarily giving road space, taking it away from cars and giving it to bike riders. And that's a great example of a local council policy experiment. You can learn a great deal from such experiments in terms of what actually enables users or prevents users or citizens to get on a bike, what does a good bike lane look like, and so on and so forth. Just the other part of the answers around what sort of policy styles actually enable experimentation in the first place. And I think that is a question we are generally exploring in our sort of transition management based approach to precinct scale transformation in Monash. So rather than thinking from a sort of a plan and provide perspective, which is predict and provide perspective, which is still sort of the dominant paradigm often in planning, we try to work a lot more through deep participatory processes, mobilizing insights from design anthropology, for instance, to actually design experiments that really connect with the daily life of people, workers, participants in the precinct. So that's a different policy style, if you like, that we're experimenting with.
Great, thank you. A question from Jeff Robinson, who's got his hand raised. So Jeff, I'm going to ask, there you go, Nancy to unmute you. Let's see if we can do that. And then go for it, Jeff. The mic is yours.
How is everyone? You look great. Look, fantastic presentations. Thanks so much to all of you. And I've certainly been inspired over the last 10 years by what Monash has done. And I've given plenty of presentations to different places in the world where I've actually kind of said, if you want to see what leadership looks like in sustainability, have a look at what Monash are doing. So my question is quite a specific one. There's actually a fair number of precincts that are being discussed at the moment. I sat in on a seminar last week, which the Property Council were putting on about developing precincts and so on. And there's precincts like Arden and Macaulay and a whole load of other, Fisherman's Bend. My question is around, if you had a magic wand on your planning thing, how would you set it up with respect to the hard and soft infrastructure that you need to have in place to deliver net zero carbon precincts? And what role do you reckon government has in that versus industry? And do we need to have a lot of the utility companies coming on board as well? Sorry, big question, so in the round kind of thing.
Big problem, big question. Amandine, I might direct to you the question of role of governments in net zero, and with a mind to sort of precinct scale. And then Rob, I'll come to you for some of the hard and soft infrastructure questions.
Yeah, so in terms, I mean, everyone's got a role to play. It's probably the short answer. There are currently some potential barriers, for example, to ensure that that planning can be done differently at a local scale. So, for example, we talked to a few councils who were interested at looking at, could we say that our council can apply net zero criteria requirements to new builds, and that would not technically be possible under current regulations at the state level. There would need to be a change in regulation. So if there are barriers like that, you would definitely want to have the governments play their role and adapt policies or regulation to ensure that precincts can do what they want. But we also are seeing that a lot of businesses and so on are just deciding to take a lead and not wait for government support. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question fully, but yes, making sure that at least the roadblocks are removed so that organizations can apply the level of ambition that they want to apply.
And either of the Robs, do you want to comment on the broader role of energy industry or soft infrastructure in that?
I'm happy to have a go. I think it's indeed a big question, but there are a couple of principles you could say when it comes to hard and soft infrastructures. In terms of hard infrastructures, I strongly believe that neighborhoods or cities that are designed around, let's say, 20-minute neighborhoods principles, where many functionalities that people need, such as work and shopping and exercise and so on, are within walkable or cyclable distances. Good public transport hubs that connects the neighborhoods to other parts of the city, combined with well-designed housing that isn't taking up too much space per inhabitant, so quite dense homes, of building which are low to zero energy. Those are sort of the hard principles of infrastructure, I think, that are important. The soft infrastructure, I think, really goes back to my earlier answer around how do councils or local governments engage with their citizens. And I've seen that Darren Sharp, for instance, is on this call as well, and it's his interest is really in understanding new forms of governance principles in how councils can relate to their community members. And I think that's an example of a soft principle which is equally crucial. So we can design net zero precincts from a top-down perspective. We have to do it in a way that aligns with as many social interests as possible. There's a normative reason to do that, because if we design cities around electric vehicles in suburban ways of living, you get a completely different kind of city when you would design it around walkable and cyclable infrastructures, each of which talk to very different sorts of interests and social groups. So there's a normative argument, but there's also an instrumental argument, because there are such huge complexities in navigating these transition processes because of the diverse social interests there, that having multiple options and deeply listening to what those interests are is just simply necessary in order to be able to move forward.
Great, thank you, Rob. Ravi, we'll come to you in a sec. Nancy, if you can get ready to unmute Raja, who's got their hand up. A question on the finance front, I guess both for Rob B and Amandine. A question regarding the climate bond program that Monash has used to support net zero, and Amandine, maybe a broader role that finance plays in the net zero transition as well.
I'll start with the climate bond and throw across to Amandine. So I guess for those of you who don't know, for the last series of buildings, particularly the net zero ones, the universities sourced its finance from the global climate bond market, which effectively means we can get long tenure, low interest financing for these buildings, which helps to move our infrastructure for our business, which is really great. It also makes a very public statement about the commitment. So effectively, this is, you know, the new market where long-term fund investors are looking for a sustainable place to put their money. And I think partly picking up on Jeff's question around how do we make this infrastructure transition, infrastructure and good infrastructure is a solid and long-term investment, which can be less fickle than some of the other investments that are available, as we've seen the share markets go up and down over the last 6 months or so. So it's a mechanism that the universities use to help itself to finance its programs. But I guess the broader question in there around the ESG position, the university statement around getting out of investments, that's something that we've actively been doing. We're out of coal. And I guess it brings to this broader question of, you know, how do you shift the share market? How do you shift this investment market? And how do you do so in a way that doesn't penalize companies that are in the transition versus companies that are locked into the old world? And maybe that's where I'll stop and hand over to Amandine.
Yeah, that's touching on a lot of different topics. So yeah, the finance sector definitely has a big role to play in the net zero transition. I think both in enabling the investments that we need to see, but also in incentivizing the transition itself. In terms of enabling the investment, the transition to net zero is very much a transition from operating cost to capital costs. For example, for energy efficiency, you know, we'll have less energy costs, but higher cost buildings. For renewables as well, we won't have to pay for fuel, but we'll have to pay for higher cost assets to start with. So there's definitely a big need for capital to be deployed to support the net zero transition. And at the moment, there's probably an increased need for to find new solutions to deploy private capital to support this. Because, for example, bonds are a really good solution to involve private investors. But from what I understand, there's a lot more demand than there is supply at the moment. And just finding a way to get the money that is available to support this transition to go to the projects that need it. In terms of investors more generally, which Rob touched on, they're definitely one of the groups that we've seen becoming much more engaged since the Paris Agreement. So banks and superannuation funds are starting to look at the net zero transition more closely and what that means for their own investments. So we are just starting to get to the point where they're becoming more comfortable to make some commitments. So it's the very beginning of that, where we are seeing movement towards more pressure for investors to companies in terms of their need to make commitments to net zero. They need to show actions that they are reducing their emissions and adapting to the transition.
Thank you. Raja, over to you for a question.
Thanks, everyone. Great presentations from Net Zero 2030. I am inspired in two ways today. One, as a director of Swan Foresight with a vision of co-creating the sustainable futures with the latest technologies. And second, you know what, with the COVID-19, we were so skeptical. How much finances are there? What's the funding model, etc. going on? And at this time, when I happen to see these presentations coming up, I am very much delighted. And I am proud to say that I am part of a small contribution I have done with Monash Microgrid in this year. So given that, now I have two questions. One is a bit lower level, that is especially, and one is a bit high level. So one question is on, I understood during my assignment and work that there are multiple building automation systems in Monash University itself, around 9. So I'm not going into the details of that. The challenge is, while these new energy ecosystems are being built, how are we integrating to that systems? Because it is hugely a cost effect. If you want to bring it onto a single platform, transformation, forget about those days. Transformation days are gone. So the question is, how are we going to ensure the existing systems are safely integrated? What could be the new operational measures? How do we set it up? That's for most probably for Rob. Then other question I have it for the other Rob, that is Rob Raven. I would love to get into living labs because I am interested in this sustainable, as I told in my vision. So as an industry collaboration, let us know how do we get into that, because there are no grants, no funds. So how do we get into research projects, etc.? over to you both, Rob.
Perfect. Thanks, Raja. Rob B, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Rob A.
Yes, integrating with existing systems picks up on some of Jeff's stuff around existing infrastructure, existing control systems, and the transition of, as Dawn, my colleague, calls them, operational technology to IoT. It's one of our biggest challenges, and it's where we're putting the vast majority of our effort right now. This is very much the focus of our Living Lab right now. How do we make the data, the systems in our campuses, in our cities interoperable? How do we use our campuses to do that? And I guess I'm optimistic that we're making good progress, early days, but I can see a pathway to bringing all of those systems together, not by replacing them all and spending a huge amount of money, but ordering the data, organizing the data, making it usable. Dawn will laugh at this, making it interoperable, so that you can use it for whatever format you want. So you can activate it for the machine learning, for the AI, all those type of things. Is very much the journey we're on. We're working with innovative partners. Just before this, I was having a chat to Honeywell, and forgive me for a little bit of a plug, but they are working with the university in data visualization, so I think it's reasonable, and looking at exactly this problem of how do you take disparate proprietary systems and bring the information into a common format. And then that makes it open to the world, makes it ready for Rob Raven to use, makes it ready for anyone who wants to pick up that and use it to help their journey. But still much learning going on in that space.
Thanks. I guess thanks for that great question, Raja. And I think again, sort of two answers. First, I would say maybe there are not so many grants, but there are grants, so we should together try and get some of those to work for us what we want to do. The second one is, I think, in terms of living labs, I mean, budgets and having grants are important, but there might not be the most important challenges in terms of getting a living lab off the ground. We've recently, we're in the process of finishing a program of work still in the Netherlands, where we've worked with 4 cities and regional actors around cycling living labs. And we've done a review on some of the challenges that we've found doing that actually. And there are more related things like how do you actually build partnerships and work together in a living lab across organizations that haven't or that not yet used to work together. Second one is how do you get to a shared vision of or expectation about what the future looks like? That is again something that is not easy to accomplish and takes a lot of time. And the third one is around how do you organize learning processes? How do you actually collectively learn what works, what doesn't work, what is desirable and what is not desirable? And these are, of course, if you have a budget to do that, that helps. But this is also much more about issues of trust, having the time to do that. And we can start doing that tomorrow. You know, if you are a front runner in this place and we are front runners in this place, let's sit around the table and see how together we can get into these kind of processes that enable living labs. Much of the living lab stuff is also about just opening up organizational processes. So how do you change some of the organizational processes or the procedures or the institutions that actually allows a university to become the living lab? That's probably a much bigger challenge than to find the next 100K to do actually the experimentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Raja. Look, we're at time, but Nancy has extended the webinar because we have a few more questions that people have. Appreciate if you have to drop off. Thank you very much for attending, and just checking the panel. It's okay to hang on for another few minutes to try and get through these last few questions. So one is, I'm going to try and group a couple of questions. One from Alicia McCallum, and there was one earlier, really looking at consideration of net zero beyond, I guess, the infrastructure and the transport pieces, to start looking into the supply chain side of things, and how do we start to make sure that we're considering those emissions in our practices, as well as the products we're purchasing and the like. So maybe one for Amandine and Rob to rock, paper, scissors on who wants to have a first go at how we're thinking about that challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's, hopefully I'm understanding the question okay. I think that's where the inclusion of all scopes of emissions is really important. and not just looking at what is scope 1 and 2. So scope 1 and 2 is the kind of operational emissions, the emissions from your buildings, your cars, and so on. But scope 3 is everything that you influence. And it's really important to look comprehensively at your emissions, because then you can find actually potentially novel solutions. And some of the things that are some of the solutions that are being more and more talked about are around circular economy. And instead of just looking at, well, how can we make steel and cement more efficient, you could actually look, for example, at can we actually reduce the need for steel and cement production, both from an efficiency perspective, but also from a recycling perspective, from the production cycle, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of cases in which you could actually avoid the emission source and then reduce the task that you've got at hand. Thinking scope 3 is not always very easy, and for example, the question that we had before on the online learning is a good example. Also need to consider about how online learning is increasing the emissions that you're enabling through students being at home and potentially being in pretty inefficient buildings themselves, and that is something that is a lot harder to control. So I guess I'm just trying to illustrate that there are some benefits, but also a lot of complex issues when you start looking at things comprehensively.
Thanks. Rob, did you want to add anything to that?
Assuming you're speaking, Rob B. Well, I guess the journey of looking certainly at buildings is where we've been focused. Retrofitting buildings, one of the questions there, very hard to do. But important to find that sweet spot of energy efficiency and balancing materials, because the embodied carbon in the existing buildings is critical. We've done some deep retrofits where we've kept everything we could. We kept all the steel and the concrete, just got rid of the asbestos. No one wants that anymore. But the uplift of that is, very high performance buildings, and it's really finding that sweet spot between high performance buildings and the cost of renewable energy, because going too deep in building retrofit starts to eat into the savings of that embodied carbon and finding that cost benefit analysis. So I guess coming back to sort of the key question there, we're starting on this journey. The big challenge for it is that materials is so bespoke to every product in every building. For net zero operations, there's the sort of 4 or 5 pillars, depending on how you count them. And, you can set that out and you can roll it across your precinct, across your city. Every single building we build is different, uses different materials. And if you've done the research, it's relatively achievable. The buildings that have done the the Living Building Challenge, looking back at it, it was very achievable, but the amount of time that it took to do the research. So I think it is getting that market awareness, getting that market research up, so it's easy to make those choices. We're now doing life cycle analysis of our buildings retrospectively, which is useful and it's a good study, but some of the things that are coming out of it are so obvious when you have the time, but you often don't have the time in the construction. So I guess some of the good things we've made, obviously the timber ones, the Woodside teaching and learning building, not the correct name, apologies, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's achieved carbon neutral construction. So that's an initiative that Lend-Lease brought to the market, the first one in Australia, which is really great. So it's an emerging space and we're learning, and we're very much keen to learn and work with industry, because it's certainly, again, one that we can't solve on our own. It's got to be that full life cycle, but very much, again, watch this space for us.
And while you're unmuted, Rob, the last question before we wrap up, just noting that there will be a webinar specifically on the microgrid in the near future, but I guess contextualising the role of the microgrid in achieving net zero more broadly.
Yeah, so I guess the microgrid for us is, how do cities interact with the grid, and how do you take advantage of that? So the easy example there is that if you're a factory and grid prices get incredibly expensive, you turn off your manufacturing line, you find that sweet spot between what does it cost me versus what am I losing from manufacturing. Cities are complicated. You need 1,000 different pieces of equipment to synchronize and do that. And I guess that comes to that interoperability, the coordination and control of that kit. And effectively the microgrid is the framework that sits over top of that, that says, what is the market doing? What can I do as a grid? And where are the benefits? I guess a really nice example that I throw to here to simplify it, given that I'm not the microgrid expert, Scott actually is South Australia Water are targeting net zero costs. They've got generation infrastructure, they've got storage infrastructure, and they do a lot of pumping. effectively they've got their control system set up. So when electricity is free, or even they're paying to take it, you know, they do their pumping, and when electricity is expensive in the market, they're generating, they're releasing their storage. So they're trying to set up a grid and a market environment where they're neutralizing their energy bill by being dynamic in the market. And at a city scale, that's very complicated, and that's very much what the microgrid's trying to do, and to play in all those socio-economic factors of what choices do individuals make within a city that can contribute to that, and how do they benefit from it. So getting the community involved in that broader energy market, or as Tony coined it, the transactive energy market.
Perfect. Thank you. And that, I'll end it there in terms of the Q&A and wrapping up. So firstly, a big thank you to our panelists for their time and effort in presenting and answering your questions. Thank you very much to you for your questions and your engagement as well. Thanks to Nancy and Karen behind the scenes for their effort in organising this and making it happen. A couple of reminders. So the Monash Energy Institute page has some details on upcoming webinars. We are also running a professional development course in conjunction with the Green Building Council in October. So the Green Building Council of Australia will have some details on that related to the work Rob and the team have done on the net zero ready and passive house buildings. Anyone wanting further info related to what's been spoken about today or net zero and how to get involved more broadly, you can email netzero@monash.edu or visit the website. I think the details will come up at the end of this chat. I think Karen's already posted them. And so thank you all very much for your time and effort, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday afternoon.